To it. 1, 2, 3. Just give me some more. Clap your hands. Give me some more. Just give me some more.
Well, hello, and welcome to My Whiskey Den, your favorite public access whiskey review show where craft whiskey is king. And tonight we have Chris from Westland on. Thank you for stopping in. But at this point of the show, Mike, what do we usually get out of the way right away so we don't forget?
Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit that bell notification so you can find out when the new videos are coming out. And don't forget, almost every single Monday is a live and evening with series, just like we have tonight here with our friend Chris.
All right. And thank you, everyone, for coming in the chat. We appreciate it. It's always good to see you. Oscar, always good to see you this evening. Emily. Ben's sneaking in there as well, too. So good to see you. Thank you for showing up early. We always appreciate the people that don't dawdle in beforehand, which is what I would be doing. So thank you for being on time. Chris, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. From what we have had of your distillery already, we already know we were super impressed by what was coming out. And then when you start getting behind the scenes, which really does not take much with your company, you kind of leave the curtain wide open, to be honest. It really pulls you in there and gets that second level effect when you're having whiskey to kind of create the experience that we think is all really unique. So thank you for being here. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, guys, I'm really excited to be on. Thanks for having me. It's funny to hear people on your side of the table talk a lot about transparency, because to me it seems like such an obvious part of the equation, right? Why wouldn't we want people to be excited about what we do? It's, inevitably you guys become brand advocates for us, and the people that are watching, the people that are listening, they're going to become brand advocates as well. So making sure that they have all the information is a huge part of being able to evangelize something that you're really excited about.
Mm-hmm. It is, and Oscar's right here. It's Westland night. He wouldn't dare miss this. So it's
smart man.
Not going to be late. So we appreciate it. Before we get into Westland, what's your kind of background before you joined the company?
Yeah, so I've been in whiskey a little while now. I got my first start in sort of distilled spirits with a fine wine distributor here in Connecticut. This would have been back in 2006, roughly. So I've been doing this a little while. I did that for a couple of years, got an opportunity to run their spirit selling division, and then got hooked up with Gordon and MacPhail, the independent bottler out of Scotland, as their national brand ambassador. And this was right around the time when they were really starting to kind of get focused and launch up Ben Romick, which was their own cell-phone distillery in northwestern Speyside. And from there, I had a really good career with them. Got made a keeper of the Quake, which was super exciting. Won Scotch Whiskey Ambassador of the Year by Whiskey Magazine. It was a really fantastic opportunity for me to grow and learn about whiskey. For anyone that's trying to get into the whiskey business, starting with an independent bottler is a great way to become like skin deep on a lot of different distilleries that you have to work with and sell and be able to talk about their product. But I always knew that I would have loved the opportunity to sort of represent an American distillery. I'm obviously, an American, no major surprise there, I'd imagine, for most people. But, I wanted something that was on the up and coming, and I knew I wanted to do something specifically with malt whiskey because that's what my personal passion is. I don't know, I always try to fix the shelves up so there's not a lot of bourbon in the background, but I'm sure there's a bottle sticking around here. But it's mostly for when we've got friends and family over that for some reason just haven't caught the malt bug yet. But no, I'm a big single malt drinker. I've been for many years, and Westland was just this incredible opportunity to do something that was not only building a distillery, but also simultaneously sort of establishing this entirely new category in American single malt, which admittedly, if you look back in the relatively recent history of distilled spirits, there aren't a lot of entirely new categories, right? You've got things that have become really popular, but have existed prior to this. But there's been nothing really that is just sort of been created from step one. And that's where American single malt comes in. And it's a real pleasure to be able to not only go around the US and do this, but to now go around the world and have those conversations with consumers where we make this joke, but it's very true. This is the only country on the planet, really, when you say the word whiskey, the assumption isn't a barley-based whiskey. This is one of the few places you go. I mean, here it's, the expectation is, okay, it's going to be a corner or rye-based distillate, understandably so. But if you go to France, if you go to Singapore, Australia, Japan, United Kingdom, parts of Southern Africa, all of those places, they're going to be like, oh yeah, it's a malted barley-based spirit. Single malt whiskey is more malt whiskey is what whiskey's made of.
Well, and I think we've said on the show before that since a lot of distilleries that are creating kind of American single malts are coming into the 10-year range of their age, and there's some young ones that are putting out some neat stuff too, we're kind of in, it hasn't happened yet, but we feel like we're kind of at the beginning steps of like the age of the American single malt, where rye, we already think kind of blew up and it's kind of almost started to tame down. Though there'll still be a craze for it because of the spiciness and stuff, but we really think that's where a lot of it is headed. And I just love how you leaned into the malt. Like you guys leaned into the climate and the region quite a bit. Like right off the bat, you guys decided you were going to be kind of focusing on what works in the area, not what some people wanted. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to have pride in the sort of culture of your region, and then be like, well, we're not going to work with the agricultural system that exists here. And frankly, the Pacific Northwest is a barley and wheat growing region. If you drink beer in this country, more often than not, that barley is going to be grown within the greater sort of Pacific Northwest, Western Montana, Idaho, Oregon, Washington State. That's really the region. So for us and for Matt from day one, when he was setting up Westland, it wasn't so much this idea of like, well, what type of whiskey we want to make. It was like, well, there's barley here. The only type of whiskey you can make out of that is single malt. Let's make single malt.
Yeah. I was just happy you guys leaned into it. There's some other people that don't, and you just for as open and transparent you are, it just pulls another level down. So I just really dig that.
Well, it's glad to see that it's recognized. It is. I will tell you, we talk about this a lot at Westland, but we don't do anything the easy way. Quite literally, nothing we do at Westland is done the easy way. We do things very intentionally. Everything, you'll probably see it on some of our bottles and things, but the words thoughtfully made are really prominently featured. That is very much a mantra of the Westland team, the way that we do business, the way that we perceive sort of our role in the industry. It's being thoughtful. It's doing things intentionally with purpose to ensure that we're making better conditions for all of our partners. It's not just about Westland Distillery. It's about the culture of the Pacific Northwest, our farming partners in the Pacific Northwest. It's about getting people to experience American single malt and developing a category that, frankly, gives all the producers that are within it. And mind you, now we're well over 100 other producers in the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission. I think it's north of 150 now. For them to have a sort of vanguard in this and look at us and see, okay, these guys have been able to do it quite successfully. How do we sort of join the ranks of this and get really excited about it?
And you guys were part of the American Single Malt Commission early on. Were you guys one of the founders?
We were the founder. Yeah. So we sort of set it up. So Steve Hawley, who's our director of marketing, also acts as the sort of president, executive director of the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission. And last year, him and myself and Matt, we went around the country with other member producers of the American Single Malt Commission, basically doing panel style open forums around the U.S., getting people just familiar with what American single malt is. It's one of those things where I think we take for granted a lot just how detail-driven the whiskey industry can be to non-whiskey drinkers, right? For the four of us, and for everyone kind of following along, you write this stuff down and you go, well, okay, it's American single malt. It's single malt made in America. It's pretty obvious. That is not the way the general consumer thinks. And a big part of the commission and a big part of, frankly, your role in this industry and our role as a distillery is to bring people into the fold and to make this information not only accessible, but easily digestible.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Sorry about that.
So what's been with you moving into a small American distiller? What's been your biggest shock versus where you were before?
Oh God, getting to wear jeans and a flannel shirt every day to work would be great. I gotta be honest with you. No, Gordon MacPhail was a pretty suited and booted kind of environment, and rightfully so. It's a 125-year-old family-owned firm, so they were pretty mindful of the aesthetics of it in the right way. I think it's more the way that we talk about whiskey. So for an independent bottler, you talk about whiskey very much so in terms of what you can control. You can control maturation, you can control barrel type. You can control a bit of the storytelling, but for an independent distillery like Westland, what we talk about is raw material selection. We're really we're really sort of focused on how do we make sure that each of these individual ingredients, and it's there, there's not many raw materials in whiskey, right? You've got water, you've got oak, you've got yeast, and you've got malt, and then an enormous amount of copper. And then aside from that, you're kind of there. So the thing that always surprised me was how so many places will go out of their way to not discuss, frankly, the role of the raw materials, and very specifically barley and yeast. But they'll talk almost ad nauseum, frankly, about the cask maturation, the amount of time, and what the barrels do. But inevitably, the alcohol is produced by a process of the fermentation of those sugars from the starch, right? Your barley interacting with the yeast. So why wouldn't we want to spend some time understanding and really detailing how those things create flavor? And that's a huge part of the Westland storytelling.
And you guys have a big selection of malts that you use, but I mean, just on the show, I know this year with chocolate malt and caramel malt, I mean, even if it's things we've had that had even like 10% of that in there, you could tell such a unique difference just from that little bit. And it's always nice to, as a consumer, it's nice to know where that's coming from, rather and kind of reassure yourself of where you're getting the flavors from, rather than like thinking you're right and being horribly wrong.
It's easy to tell yourself you taste the strawberries when in fact there are no strawberries in the whiskey. No, I get what you're saying, and for us, we're really heavily influenced, and I've talked about this already a bit, but I'll dive into it. We're influenced by the culture of the Northwest, right? When we started, there wasn't this rich distilling history in the Pacific Northwest. Westland really helped to develop some of that and to push it forward. There were, to be clear, other distilleries in the Pacific Northwest at the time, but building it up and frankly getting people to think of our region as a place where single malt should be coming from, that's something that Westland can really kind of put up on the wall and say, we've helped to do that. With regards to the sort of the culture of the region, though, there was this great brewing culture, and a lot of what you see in our 5 malt selection, and 5 malts really our house style malt or our house style recipe that we use for a majority of the whiskeys, and that's a Washington State grown base pale malt, 2-row pale. It's a Washington State 2-row Munich malt, so a light roasting level, and then 3 specialty malts. You've got Briess Extra Special, comes out of Wisconsin. You've got pale chocolate malt and brown malt, both from the United Kingdom, coming from Thomas Fawcett Maltings. But all of those malts are really coming from the ideal place, and obviously pale chocolate malt and brown malt, that's an actual kilning roasting level to get to that. Those flavors, if we were to sit down and go to any brewery on the planet, you hand them that malt bill, they're going to tell you you're going to end up with something that's akin to a sort of stout/dark amber style beer. But there was no one on the whiskey side of the business that was really looking at those things going like, oh, you could make whiskey out of this. And it wasn't because there wasn't the knowledge base to do it. It was because people looked at the cost of those grains. Specialty roasted malts are significantly more expensive than base pale malts. And they said, well, if you're going to lay the whiskey down for 10 years in a barrel, and fundamentally people didn't believe that barley flavor actually transferred to distillate, then why would you spend all that money? And I find that kind of interesting because literally the first releases of Westland, things like literally the very first thing, Deacon Seed, that's this 5 malt recipe that you can taste it. And you go, well, obviously there's roasted malt in this, because to your point, that coffee and chocolate, you can't miss it. I'll be the first to admit, I do not have some super palate. I've got a really good memory, and I like to talk, which is pretty much all you need to sell whiskey nowadays. I will tell you that if you taste these whiskeys and you don't pick up on that, you probably have a cold, because it's just such an obvious, overwhelming part of the flavor. Listen, people come out all the time and they're like, oh, do you get this very precise note? And sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. But coffee and chocolate are such staple flavors and aromatics of these whiskeys, it's hard not to pick them up.
Excuse me. Yeah. I'm sorry. I had to have a little sip and a sniff, but I know
I'm working along as well. You're fine.
Yeah. I know we'll get into the whiskey tasting here in a little bit, and you did kind of go over already about like what makes the climate unique and special there. Where do all your grains come from? Do most of the grains that you use, are they local?
Yeah. Well, okay. So locals, I guess, is a subjective thing. It depends on how big your state is what qualifies as local. Washington State's a big place. So, 80% of our 5 malt, all of our Washington State grown pale malt comes from Washington State. It's going to be in the Palouse region. So if you think of the state of Washington State's almost 2 really very unique environments in one state geography, right? So you've got the Cascade Mountain Range that intersects the state north to south, really in the sort of central region. West of the Cascades is going to be really lush, really green climate. Obviously, Seattle's over there. You've got the Olympic Mountain Range. It's absolutely gorgeous. East of the Cascades, also really beautiful, but a completely different environment, right? You've got the high desert. Everything's at altitude. It's perfect growing climate for growing barley. But it's going to be more on your larger commodity style scale, right? You're going to be seeing much larger farms, lands at a much lower cost comparatively to Western Washington. But that Palouse region grows some of the finest barley on the planet. So all of our Washington state grown pale malt, that is certified Washington state grown. A majority of it's going to be coming specifically from that region. The Munich malt is also coming from that region, but it's getting obviously toasted at Great Western Maltings down in Vancouver, Washington, right on the Oregon border. Mm-hmm. So that 80% of our 5 malt comes locally from the state. Now we're doing loads of experimentation with individual varietals of malt up in the Skagit Valley, which is about 90 minutes north of our distillery. But when you start looking into things like Briess Extra Special, only Briess is the only maltster on the planet that owns the right to make Briess Extra Special. It is a proprietary roasting recipe. We literally can't ask them for it. They would never give it up, right? It's something bespoke to their business. So that's coming from the Midwest. We know whether or not it's specifically coming from Wisconsin or potentially Minnesota, we don't get that level of detail from them. And then things like Thomas Fawcett, who does our brown malt and our pale chocolate malt, that makes up about 4% each of the overall mash. Those are going to be coming from the United Kingdom, whether that's England or Southern Scotland.
Well, that's not bad at all. Like you said, 80% of is the bulk of what you're doing is all local. That's pretty good. And we know other places that were just honest when they were starting to do some of the malt, some of the barley and stuff. It was, well, our region just doesn't make it well. So so 85% of it is coming from someplace else. So that's just the way it is. And like, well, hey.
This is an interesting thing because I'm always torn on this issue, right? I love the idea of celebrating your locality and having those localized ingredients, but I'm also of the mindset that if you want to be creative and you want to do something really special, and you have the freedom to do that, then by all means do so. But be very transparent in where those things are coming from. I think that's a really big part of the conversation. We tell people, anyone that'll listen when they come through, the goal here is not to be this great Washington State distillery. It's not even to be like the pride of Seattle kind of thing, right? That's not the goal. The goal is to be a globally recognized single malt producer, to be recognized as a quality producer anywhere in the world. We had a guy come up to us in Japan. Matt and I were over there about 6 months ago, 8 months ago. Time has lost all meaning at this point, but 8-ish months ago, talking about how well made he thought the whiskeys were. And that is like, it's incredible to hear those things because you realize that when someone comes in that's from the neighborhood in Soda where our distillery is and they get excited about it, we certainly do as well. But we always have to temper that with this understanding of like, people want to celebrate their local team, right? They want to support you. They want to get excited about it. And it's the curse of craft beer, right? Everyone's like, oh, these guys are great. They're right down the road. And it's like, well, actually they're just down the road, but whether or not they're great, that's a different animal. For us, right. it's avoiding that curse and really kind of holding ourselves to a different standard and saying, no, what we want to make is incredible whiskey. We want to make whiskey that if it's being consumed in Seattle or Singapore is going to be recognized as some of the best in the world.
So if you had to tell people what can Westland do, I guess maybe, I don't know. I don't mean to make you say something that could be construed as arrogant, but what can Westland do that other people can't?
I think if I had to pick one specific thing that we can do that other people can, is that we're very strict with ourselves. And I think that's a much more challenging thing than people probably give it credit for. It's really easy for distilleries when they get up and running to say, okay, well, we need to keep the lights on, so we're going to do this. And Westland, we were really fortunate that even prior to Remy Cointreau acquiring the distillery back in 2017, we were really well funded. So there wasn't this idea of like, okay, we've got to make gin or we've got to make vodka to keep the lights on, and then we'll make whiskey 4 or 5 years from now, or we'll kind of get that going, or we'll buy a bunch of produced spirit and then we'll put our labels on it. That didn't even enter the equation at Westland, because the whole point of what we're trying to do at Westland is to celebrate not only just the region, but also the culture of the region. And if you start that by a story that you have to fabricate instead of being authentic with, that makes for a very challenging long-term perspective. And, you know, we're really lucky now that with Remy, they've kind of embraced this even more so. I mean, we're fully funding a PhD student at Washington State University's Bread Lab up in the Skagit Valley, working on flavor development in barley. Mind you, that we won't own the academic research, so it'll be open source and available for farmers out in Skagit Valley. So it's that sort of thing. There are so many opportunities in the last 5 years with Westland that we could have just done things that were good for us, but not good for American single malt or not good for the industry, that we've avoided because we recognize that we hold ourselves to a much higher standard. And frankly, this mantle of responsibility that exists as a founder of the American Single Malt Commission means that we are acting on more than just behalf of our own interests. And that is something we take really seriously.
Is there a whiskey that you guys, just in thinking about this with your kind of integrity culture that you've got, you know, with making things that everyone's like, we are not making this. And it comes up again, it's like, no, we are not going to make this.
So, I'll say this in a caveat. I feel like this is a dangerous question, to say the least. But, we get one day a year that we get to do something kind of off the walls. We have, for the last couple of years, with the exception of 2020, we've released an April Fool's release where we get to maybe poke a little bit of fun at the industry. So I can tell you, like, God, I wonder if I even have a bottle of it here, but I've got a little miniature sample of it. But like, we did a whiskey called Celebrious, where the label was a mirror 2 years ago, and the idea was that you could be your own whiskey celebrity and endorse your own whiskey. We made like a bunch of little commercials, and then the one that I think everyone has heard of is probably Bold Smooth, where Matt did this like 6-minute video where we're like serenading a whiskey. It's ridiculous. Those are the kind of moments where we sort of like kind of recognize, listen, the industry occasionally needs to really take a hard look at what they're wanting to do and what they're trying to do, and maybe lay off of it a little bit. And, you know, for us, it's a fun thing to do and kind of pick at it. But, you know, whiskey's tough. It's a tough business. So if that's the way people want to run their business, I've said this before and I will say it 1,000 times over. There is no greater judge and jury than a consumer with disposable income. Either you buy the whiskey or you don't. And I will tell you that time and time again, what we do at Westland gets bought off the shelf, and that means that we're doing something right.
Yeah, definitely. And even with just the ones we're tasting here, you guys have some other special releases that are unique, and they're hard to come by. You know what I mean? And they are very sought out, those releases when they pop up. So I know there's a scramble here in Wisconsin. It's hard to pick some of those up here, but yeah.
I know there's a couple of really great accounts out in Wisconsin. I have fond memories of going out and working that market years ago. It's exciting for us. Obviously, I think the whiskey that people tend to think about when they think of limited release Westland is Garyana, which is our sort of work with the native oak species in the Pacific Northwest called Garyana.
It's right absolutely delicious. I had it at Distill America a couple years ago, and it is fantastic.
It's a really wonderful whiskey, and if there's a whiskey that embodies this aspect of celebrating the Pacific Northwest and the agriculture and the culture of it, it's embodied in Garyana and what we're trying to do with that. So the 2020 release of Garyana will be coming out in like 2 or 3 months from now. So it is rapidly approaching. We made a little bit more of it this year, which should be nice. So hopefully it'll ease the burden of actually being able to get a bottle for some people. Also, we're going to be really mindful of trying to make it available via e-commerce with partners around the country as much as possible to give everyone an equal chance as much as we can. Yeah. Easier said than done, to say the least.
Yeah.
Oh, you can only imagine it's different distributors in different states and who you have to go through. It all gets a little convoluted at one point.
I would imagine. It's worth it.
And kind of on that note, with the pandemic and stuff, is there a point with laws in your state that you would like to see a couple of them go away? Like in Texas and other places, they would like to be able to ship directly to the customer, at least in the state, or be able to pick up more than 2 bottles in a month at the distillery, or like Minnesota, where they can sell you more than 1 375 when you show up, which is horrific. I'm going to bag on you, Minnesota, every time I can for that. That's just horrible. Because we kind of think this. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Chris.
No, I was going to say, we've been really lucky. Washington State, I would argue, in the time of COVID, I think the state government's been really nimble to activating laws that are going to allow distilleries and breweries and wineries within the state of Washington to be successful. They've just changed their laws about allowing us to sell full spirit cocktails, which is exciting. Meaning not only can we can sell you a full spirit cocktail, but we can make it with ingredients that aren't necessarily just made at the distillery. Because as you can imagine, it's kind of hard to do that when your only one spirit choice is whiskey, which granted for me is pretty simple because this is my favorite cocktail on the planet. But for a lot of consumers that come in that want to have a drink or make a mixed drink, we were having to produce all of our own mixers, which was fun, but it was enormously time consuming for the front of the house team. So they've done that. They've just allowed reopening of tasting rooms to a certain degree. So I will say Governor Inslee and the state of Washington has actually done a really nice job. I mean, obviously, Washington State has the highest or one of the highest liquor taxes in the country. So I'd imagine that consumers there would probably like to see that shift slightly. But no, for the most part, it's hard to say a lot of bad things about Washington State. They've done a really nice job with this year specifically. And then, frankly, just listening to the Washington Distillers Guild. They seem to have formed the right kind of partnership where it's based on respect and, frankly, an awareness for each other's needs.
Well, and I feel like that hasn't happened in other places where maybe some of the states don't realize how and whiskey industries were kind of tourist attractions and made people go out and venture for day trips or do unique stuff like that where they lost a lot of tourism money by doing that. Because I know it's places I look for when I'm going, and it's starting to become that way more and more for the average mainstream person or person that's, well, maybe the people I'm going with just assumed we're doing it. But that's great that they're actually doing that, because there's a lot of them that seem to just be kind of ignoring that whole fact, going, well, if you close, someone else will take your place. You know, like that. There's a couple states.
I will tell you, that is a dangerous mindset. This is, I'll be the first to admit, you know, we're really fortunate, obviously, with strong financial backing at Westland. There are a lot of distilleries in this country that are not going to be the same level of fortune, and they're going to really struggle coming into the end of the year because it's always difficult when the opportunity is, okay, the market's coming back. Well, how do we make ourselves really appealing? And the natural instinct is to drop price. And the reality of it is that is a double-edged sword, because once it goes down, it can rarely come back up. It's really hard to do that. And for a small producer, you know, we talk about thoughtfully made at Westland, thoughtfully made that everyone benefits in the chain. And that means us, it means the retailer, it means you, the consumer, the distributor. It means that everyone can actively, whiskey doesn't need to be a zero-sum game, right? Everyone can enjoy a little part of the spoils of that. The challenge that you face is for small producers is that often they don't get to that level. And that's really disappointing because there's such an enormous amount of really good quality whiskey out in the marketplace right now. I mean, there are probably amazing whiskeys that none of us will have tasted before they go out. And that's such a real shame, because there's a lot of talented people out there and a lot of people that have put an enormous amount of effort into making good whiskey.
Yeah, we've come across a couple of those where down by Ben had picked up a whiskey down in South Carolina, and we finally got to the point to review it, because we have a stack of whiskeys. Everyone has samples, and you're working your way through them. And like 2 days after before we were going to review it, Ben's like, yeah, they're closing next Thursday. So let's get to it. I was like, and then it was actually pretty damn good. So it was really even good. More annoying. And we're like, I think when we were talking to Single Cask Nation, we're like, do you think there's, maybe not for them, but it could be like this, a conglomerate that would go buy from distilleries that are closing and be like, here, we have these lost casks from like 10 years from now.
It already exists. It's certainly out there already. The question is, what do people want to do with that stuff? Do they want to let it, they want to sit and hold on to it and wait a little while? Because potentially, we all know this, sometimes things don't become famous until they're gone, sort of thing. And I think we're going to see that. There's going to be this round of sort of collectible, hard-to-find whiskeys that come out of places that maybe existed for a very sort of short moment in time.
Mm-hmm.
So is Westland making your favorite whiskey yet?
Oh yeah, for sure. We've been doing it for some time. I mean, listen, it's going to be sort of the boring corporate answer, but it's the absolute truth. Is, to me, what I get out of American Oak as our sort of daily driver whiskey is just fantastic. I love that whiskey. It is the whiskey that I consume on a basically daily basis because I just think it's so interesting. That whiskey, and I know this is hyperbole, and I get it. I'm a company man, vested interest in this, but I will tell you what we do in Westland American Oak. If it were any other distillery on the planet, that'd be $150 bottle whiskey. Because they look at it and they go, okay, it's roasted malt, it's air-dried new white American oak. They use a funny yeast strain. It's aged for 4 years. People would look at that and they'd be like, oh my God, that's a limited edition whiskey unto itself.
Right.
But the reality of it is that for us, that's the way we make whiskey. That is literally the entry-level offering from our distillery is all of those things I just described. And that's the thing that always gets me because it's, for other producers, you see a lot of the things that we have done at Westland as sort of our base, right? Our fundamental approach to making whiskey has become limited edition offerings at other distilleries. And that always kind of surprises me because when I see the prices of those things, I go, God, if people really sat down and took the time to get to know Westland, they'd realize that they can have all of these things simultaneously for half the price.
Yeah, and then that is exactly true. And since you did send us some of these lovely whiskeys, and we're talking about the American Oak, do you guys, everyone else feel like having another drink of this real quick, kind of giving some tasting notes on it, or
Twist
if you have,
Yeah.
now we could have Chris explain it, but in this lovely book, which I don't know if I put out to everyone before because we were talking beforehand, this is a fantastic book. It gives you every bit of information you could ever want to know if you were doing it. How big the stills are, how big the mash drums are, how much different barley is involved in. There's all the answers in here that you're going to want to know. So whiskey nerds in the chat, they have these wonderful, fantastic things that make you think maybe, just maybe, I should get my own still, but it's not going to work. It doesn't work. It doesn't work out that way.
We will tell you everything you need to know. The only thing we won't do is help you raise the money to build your distillery. Other than that, it's all on you. But no, I mean, it's one of those things that's, you were talking about it before as a joke, but seriously, it's like, there's no value in hiding that stuff. Listen, people are smart enough now. You get people that go on to the TTP Cola registration website now. That's a public registry, and they write about the labels that we have, things that are sort of sitting in process that are about to get approved, and we're months away from releasing these things. That's the nature of the beast. So it just doesn't seem like there's a huge value to hiding that stuff. Listen, again, I want you to be excited about Westland. The best thing that we could potentially do is make you want to tell other people about Westland.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what it does, because it lets you nerd out if you want to, and if you're one of the people that doesn't really care, you feel like you got all the information you could to make a decision on something, and there's no way you're going to be frustrated by that. Like you went to go buy something and is like, well, I left and that dude knew exactly what the hell he was talking about, and I really enjoy this too, but I just had to share it, and I'm going to say this. What I like about your stuff is you can tell, like, with the oak that you're using or the sherry or the peat that you're adding to it, how nicely balanced it is when it comes in there. It's not aggressive on anyone, but but you do get those flavors where sometimes there's some other stuff that's a little more like super grain forward where you almost don't even taste the barrel. You are getting that in a lot of these here. It is really nice the way that it goes through.
Yeah, it's about, there's a protectionism that has to exist with your house style, right? When you look at something like American Oak is the trunk of the Westland tree. Everything that we do is based off of that core philosophy. It's 5 malt barley bill. It's a Belgian Saison brewing yeast for fermentation. It's air-dried new white American oak for maturation. And it's built around this sort of idea that all of these materials, all of these ingredients should be readily apparent in the aromatics and in the taste of the whiskey. But when we do things like sherrywood and when we do things like peated, the intention there is to say, okay, how would those types of styles of spirits taste when they're treated with our house profile, not the other way around, right? And that's the best way to do things, because everyone's had a sherried whiskey that has so much sherry that you can't taste anything else. Well, what's the point of us, from a distillery perspective, what's the point of hitting something with so much PX or so much Oloroso that in fact you can't taste the 5 malt, or you can't taste the yeast, the intention of the yeast, or you can't taste any air-dried new white American oak. And the same with peated. If all you taste is peat, listen, I like peated whiskey as much as anyone, but if that's all you taste, there's no nuance, that there's no balance. In fact, it's very simple to make out of balance whiskey. It's not a hard thing to do. You just don't focus on anything, and you let the one thing that's the strong note kind of take over. But that's, I don't know. I feel like that's an unfortunate aspect of how whiskey has become so popularized, is we get a lot of whiskey that's out of balance now, which is a bummer. I think that's shifting, and people are becoming much more astute consumers, much more mindful of getting balanced whiskey. So when people tell us that, like, that's high praise. That really makes me happy, because it means that people are understanding what we're trying to do. We want to make whiskey that tastes like Westland, but also incorporates these sort of classic ideals of what different single malt whiskey can be. But it still has to be a bottle of Westland. It has to be, as soon as someone takes a sip of sherry when they're peated, it has to remind them that it's a Westland single.
Yeah, we had that recently with what one did we have from Wyoming whiskey, where it was finished in, was it sherry or was it Pinot barrels?
No, it was the Wyoming double barrel. So that was their bourbon finished in sherry.
And when they did that one, it was the same thing like this, where you could tell it was a finishing cask and not just you put it in a barrel. Like it's a finished whiskey rather than it sat in a barrel. The way I looked at it, like with yours too, it's pulling subtle notes and it's going through there, but it's not fighting anything when it's doing it, and it's adding things that weren't there before, but letting what was there still kind of be the showpiece.
Well, that's exactly. I mean, listen, this is why at Westland it's not just Matt making the whiskey on his own. It's Matt plus Shane Armstrong, our blender, putting together these whiskeys, and that's a really important part of it. It's, listen, it's whiskey isn't paint by numbers. People probably know that, but it's worth reiterating. It's not, we don't just make 5 malt and then put it into New American Oak after fermenting it with Belgian Saison yeast, the entire time, and then just go, okay, well, 25 of those barrels, and that makes it vatting. There is a blending process to those casks to really understand that, listen, new oak from the same tree that's been air dried in the same part of the yard still gives off different flavors. And balancing those means that you have to taste every single cask that you're going to put into a vatting. And, as we've grown, our vatting size has grown to, 40, 50 barrels at a time for something like American Oak. That is a lot of nuance to manage to make sure that that's going to stay consistent, because, as distilleries get bigger and bigger, and Westland is in this sort of really exciting time where we're growing really quickly, it's managing to ensure that blend consistency is right there, right? I want someone that picks up a bottle of Westland American Oak and then comes back and buys another bottle 6, 7, or 8 months later, and it's a new vatting technically, to not have any idea that it's a new vatting. That is super important.
And it's impressive when it happens, because there's so many people when they're scaling up that are kind of going under the guise of each batch we're doing is unique, because it's hard to get the consistency that you get in some of the bigger places that in a smaller scale. So Mike and Ben, I'll let you talk about what you were getting off this for a second, but sorry, I was all excited on the nose. I was going to say there's a lot of stuff going on, and I don't want to hog the talking for a minute, which I do ramble sometimes, so I'll shut up for a second.
Yeah, I haven't had this for a while, and I miss that kind of custard on the nose. Yeah, it's now after smelling this and tasting a little bit again, it's like I got to go get another bottle.
Yeah.
The thing that I always enjoy looking for on this is, and it's really more in the aromatics than it is on the palate, but the yeast really comes through on the nose here. There's that candied orange peel, zested lemon, ripe cherry thing going on. All those fruity notes, that's all yeast, right? So we ferment at a really high fermentation temp. So we start our stuff at roughly, I want to say we pitch at about 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay. And we'll let the fermentation free rise up to 85, which if you're a beer consumer, you're a home brewer, you'll realize 85 degrees Fahrenheit is warm for yeast. For a Belgian Saison yeast, it's okay, but it's definitely at the high end of the scale, to say the least. But when you ferment at a higher temperature, you throw a lot of esters. And those esters are those really big fruity notes. And those are great at balancing some of the bitter notes that exist in the roasted malt. So to us, it's like, it's great to have dark chocolate coffee, but if those aren't balanced with something sweet and fruity, you're going to get something immensely bitter. So that's where this yeast is so critical. This is a whiskey, and again, I'm mindful of the fact that I work here, and I'm always going to say good things, but you really can pick out all of the raw materials here. You can pick out the barley in the roasted coffee, roasted chocolate. You can pick out the yeast in that orange peel, cherry, lemon zest thing. And obviously, you can pick out some of that oak with that custard, coconut cake. There's a lot of that sort of like doughy, filling kind of notes to it. And it's all readily apparent.
I'm loving the creaminess that this has. And sorry, Ben, I didn't mean to cut you off. I'll shut up. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I was going to say that's exactly what I've been getting. It's right off the bat from the pour. There was a malty chocolate note to it, and it's gone to that to like a lemon custard and even almost a banana custard note to it. And then I'm getting the orange, and I'm getting like a cherry candy coming off of it as well.
So that banana note, that's a classic high fermentation temperature Belgian Saison yeast thing.
And I'd be happy with that. And John was just wondering, and because we were saying we were getting a lot of the coffee and the chocolate notes, he's wondering if that's common across most of the brands or if it's just in a few.
Yeah,
most of the releases.
All of the Westland Core Range stuff, American Oak Sherry Peated, it's all going to be really common in something like Garyana. It's certainly less obvious, but Garyana is a much stronger flavor as that species of oak. But it's certainly a touch over there. But yeah, I mean, obviously the most obvious in American Oak, and then lesser so, but still quite powerful in Sherrywood and Peated. So we tell people all the time, our Sherrywood is really for like the person that loves that big sherry note, but maybe wants a little more backbone to the whiskey, where they want there to be some of that clear, sort of malty, grainy kind of note coming through, because it certainly does. For our peated, to me, I love our peated because it's sessionable, right? It's the peated whiskey that you can drink 2-3 glasses of, not only before a meal, but during the meal and after the meal. It's not meant to be this sort of, if all you want to drink is Octomore, and I love Octomore to death, our peated's probably going to show off pretty light to you. Look for something like our Peat Week bottling instead.
Yeah.
But if you really enjoy things like Talisker, Oban, Ben Romick, our peated is going to be right up your alley. It's got that perfect profile, just a little bit of peat to it. It's more balanced, nuanced, not something that's going to just overpower the rest of the whiskey.
And I'll say this for John, for me, the coffee notes coming in on the finish, I'm getting like a fresh espresso that's maybe a little bit on the lighter roasted side, so you get more of the bright citrusy notes out of the coffee to it. But that's what it's coming on the finish, and it's freaking gorgeous, man.
Yeah. I like to retrohale on whiskey. So after I swallow, I'll sort of breathe in through my nose really sharply and then blow out. And you get a lot of the coffee on the palate that way.
Yeah, this is just beautiful whiskey, period.
Yes, it is.
I mean, and that's for me. I'm anybody who's watched this show for the last while, you've heard me talk up American single malts, and that's becoming my absolute favorite category of whiskey here in probably the last year or so. And, and that's what I think of you guys is like, you're the ones who kind of caught the wave first, so to speak. For the last while, you think of American single malt, and usually Westland's like the first one on your mind doing this. But you've talked so much about, with Washington State and with what you guys are doing, you're unique. Obviously, the words like provenance and terroir are becoming big buzzwords in the whiskey nerd community right now. What, for you, in the notes and what you get out of this, what sets this apart for you as far as making it really distinct and unique compared to other single malts coming from across the country?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say that there's a regionalized style at this point, because obviously, even though there are a lot of American single malt producers, there's over 150 now in the U.S. We're probably not at the point that Scotland was, 60, 70 years ago, when there was, okay, this is very clearly Speyside, this is Highland, right. This is Isla, Islands, Lowlands kind of thing, Campbelltown. Will we get to that point at some point with American single malt? It's more than likely that you'll get some sort of identifiable characteristic. Because of the fact of the costing of our raw materials as being so high at Westland, it's probably going to keep a lot of producers from wanting to do that same style with roasted malts. I think, where they'll want to do roasted malts, but then they're going to use the M strain of yeast, which is just a high attenuating yeast, so they're not going to get the same flavors. I think that's going to be the challenge. It's hard to say. I don't really know what the future holds for American single malt. I mean, the big thing that we're all focused on right now is certainly getting legislated and recognized by the federal government. That is first and foremost what the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission wants. We've been in regular conversations with the TTB. They have our petition. They're looking it over. We are literally waiting on a ruling at this point now. God, without jinxing it too much, it's hard not to feel like there's a very good chance for this. We're asking to give consumers clarity and transparency into what we're doing. We set up the standard of identity for American single malt to be very clear that this is exactly what, if you see a bottle of American single malt whiskey, this is exactly what you, the consumer, can expect to be in the bottle right now. But the reality of it is that at this exact moment, and while we're fortunate that there's not a bad actor doing this, there is always the potential that could happen. So we really need this to happen sooner rather than later. And then frankly, the bigger issue is that long-term, it'll also offer us some level of protection on a global basis when it comes to opening up trade. And frankly, right now there are enormous tariffs being placed on whiskey, not only exported from the U.S. to other places, but imported from places like Scotland into the U.S. So we're really mindful of trying to get these things sort of organized and working to the greater good of not only making whiskey more cost-effective for consumers, but also just allowing you to know exactly what's in the bottle.
Well, and I think it's great that America would be creating like another class of whiskey that's unique.
Yeah.
And it's yes, you have Scotch from Scotland, but it's and stuff from Ireland as well too. But it's you're getting your own unique spin when you're getting it from a country. It's just knowing, like you said, it's knowing what you're getting, knowing the type of spin you're getting on. Well, maybe not to the extent and quality you guys are putting out, but you get the idea.
But again, the consumer is going to determine what's worth buying and what's not. It's not. Listen, one of the things that we get asked all the time around the world is, why didn't you guys put in a thing about age? Why shouldn't you put in a minimum guarantee of age? Because at the end of the day, listen, if you think you can put out outstanding whiskey in 2 years, then by all means, go for it. Go for it. If you believe that strongly in it, or maybe there's a very specific tasting profile that you want to show off, then do it. But the consumer is going to tell you whether or not it's successful, not you believing really strongly in a whiskey. And that is, I will tell you, for anyone on the distilling side of the business, that is the hardest thing to appreciate, is that you are not what you think. You are to a certain degree, but you are what your consumers think you are. Mm-hmm. And you have to embody that to a certain degree. Listen, we've become known as this place that, is pushing the needle on American single malt and frankly trying interesting things. And, we've embraced that. And we're really fortunate that our ideal version of ourselves matches quite closely with what consumers perceive us to be. But I have seen the opposite of that. When it's not aligned, it is very hard to overcome.
Yeah, I would agree completely. That's okay. And just so we don't keep Chris horribly long tonight, because we don't want to eat up all your evening, I'm going to switch over to the sherry cask, or the sherry wood on this one. And often it's just, I'll say it before, and it's just, I love how subtle and balanced it rolls in. Like, it's like obviously you guys weren't going for the slap you in the face sherry or port, or the port bomb or sherry bomb or anything like that, but it's just the amount of aroma and flavors you're getting in the nose, while it's still in my mind, compared to some other whiskeys, maybe at like a 40%, where say like George Stagg is like at an 80 or 90, where it's slapping you around a little bit. There's nothing wrong with getting slapped either some nights, but it's just that everything smells so rounded and married together well.
It's like maple syrup on pancakes on the nose. I mean, it's just,
and you still know it's sherry. It's just not. It's balanced enough that you're like, hey, it's still there. It still stands out 100%. You just didn't have to get kicked in the teeth to feel it.
Well, and that's the thing. People often, I think they forget that one of the best parts of sherry isn't necessarily just the palate of it. It's the aromatics that it can provide. Mm-hmm. Sherry, especially Oloroso, you can get some really beautiful, dried, fruity kind of things coming out, that sort of golden raisin nougat quality that this has loads of on the nose right now, which is really sort of wonderful.
Yeah.
And just not to say, I know every place is different, about how much are these running per bottle? Like
so you should be able to find American oak around the U.S. for hopefully $69.99.
Okay.
And then Sherrywood and peated should be $79.99.
When we're talking about comparison to going to like a Scotch, say blind tasting, and I didn't know where I was coming from. Like you were saying, I can see how you were saying. Usually looking at like $120 or $150 bottle of Scotch, with the flavor and the non. You guys have no green notes, and I'm sure that's because of the barrels and everything that you guys are using and having them air dried. But you are not tasting any weird funk in this. It's all flavor.
It's also good, very good quality sherry cask. We work with a producer called Toneleria del Sur down in Montilla, Spain. And the Caballo family, Rafa, the guy that runs it for us, he is just fantastic. So we buy our sherry cask in a fairly unique fashion. We don't buy breakdowns. So our barrels aren't broken down into hoop and stave in Spain and then rebuilt in the States and then sent to us. We basically buy broken down casks, fully upright built casks. They get put onto a shipping container with a small amount of shipping sherry so they'll maintain shape. They get shipped directly from southern Spain to us in Washington State and Seattle, and then they get filled within typically a week or two at our facility in Oakland where we mature most of our whiskey. You know, that is a huge part of it. We pay an enormous amount of money for our sherry cask, but we recognize that that's the right way to treat that raw material. That oak is really, those casks are really important to the profile of this whiskey. Yes, we could buy breakdowns, we could save a ton of money, and I'm sure people would probably like the whiskey as well, but that wouldn't be respecting the raw material. It wouldn't be respecting the ingredient. It's, you treat those barrels with care because they're a finite material. Sherry is not becoming more popular, quite the opposite, realistically. The more that we sort of treat sherry like it's only a thing to mature whiskey in, the more that's going to continue to hurt the sherry industry. It's going to end up costing us, frankly, a lot of these great bodegas that we are dependent on to get these beautiful quality sherry casks. And for us, this is also not 100% matured in sherry, and that's a big part of it. This is, roughly thirds. A third of the whiskey is 5 malt new American oak, so no sherry whatsoever. A third of it is a mixture of 5 malt and maybe some straight Washington pale malt cask in full maturation of Oloroso and PX, both hogsheads and butts. And then about a third of it will be 5 malt new American oak to start. And then maybe the last year or two, it'll be finished in second or third fill casks of that Oloroso and
That's nice. I like that. That's where the subtleness is kind of creeping in. It's good to see you in the chat, Ed. It's good to see you back and healthy again. Keep moving in the right direction. Sorry, one of the viewers, another whiskey reviewers, had caught COVID. So I don't know if he's drinking tonight because it's been about a month. But we're glad to see you back up and moving again. So good to see you, Ed. Ooh. All right. Now we're going to move to the peated version of this.
I saw one of the questions earlier. Someone was asking what my title is at the distillery. And it's, the official title I have is I'm the Global Commercial Director, which is a fancy way of saying I live on an airplane. I don't now. I've been home. I've been grounded for quite a few months now. But my job is to basically go around and evangelize Westland as much as I can and make a few PowerPoints and spreadsheets along the way.
That sounds like a fantastic job.
It's a pretty. I got to be honest. It's a pretty sweet gig. Excuse me. I've been at it a long time. I've worked pretty hard to get here, but it's definitely a fruit of the labor kind of thing. It's been a lot of fun. Westland's been a dream for me, to be honest. It's, I'm working with a bunch of people not only do I respect, but I enjoy the work that we do. I believe really strongly in what we're doing. It doesn't ever feel like work. Listen, not every day is easy. I'll be the first to admit that. There are some super challenging days, and we are in a very challenging period right now. But when you're doing with people you care about, that makes a huge difference to your overall enjoyment of it. And I've worked in distilleries and I've worked in other places and businesses where, people were at a job, they were doing work. And it never felt right. There's a very sort of great sense of community, a sense of family at Westland that I think has us all really bought into the central philosophy of wanting this thing to achieve something really significant. I think we're getting there.
Mm-hmm. I would definitely say you guys are just because of being in the forefront with the single malt and the commission and everything when it first started. And like you said, I looked at the founding members, and then because we had a couple different people on over the time, and then seeing everyone who's in it now, and I was like, that is a hell of a jump. And I'm sure as those other places opened up, like you were mentioning, you do hand out some advice to people as they go to maybe skip over one or two pitfalls, and maybe not everything, but the couple things. The whiskey community seems very open and kind of caring compared to other places as far as helping people getting moving.
I'm not gonna say the guy's name, but I was down in Texas. I'm not sure if he'd want me to say it, so I'll respect the privacy there. But we were down in Texas, Steve and I, maybe a year or so ago, doing an event, and a guy who owns a distillery came up to us and literally like kind of grabbed Steve and I by the arm and was like, "You guys have been an inspiration to me." And you're sitting there thinking to yourself, we are still not where we even want to be. We're still really we're doing this the right way. We're working really hard at it. So to hear someone say that it was, I'll be the first to admit, it kind of took me by surprise. I remember Steve and I went back to the hotel that night, sitting having a drink, and we're like, God, can you believe that? And then we were like, but there's going to be this group of distillers coming up now that goes like, yeah, Westland inspired me to do this thing. And I look at other members of the American Single Malt Commission. I look at, what Jared and his team are doing down at Balcones, what Colin's doing in Santa Fe, what the guys are doing at Andalusia, what they're doing over at Westward. There's some amazing single malt whiskey being made in this country right now. And not only just on the West Coast. I saw someone say that in the comments. It's like, yeah, listen, there's a real mindset for doing it on the West Coast. There's no doubt about it. We've got access to barley all over the place. That's a good thing. But boy, don't sleep on single malt, all over. There is a ton of good stuff out there right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was going to say, just between me and Charlotte, Great Wagon Road with their Rua is fantastic. And then down the road in Atlanta, ASW Distilling, their the Maris Otter they had for 2019 was incredible. So
there's a lot of really great stuff out there. They're good people. And, these are distillers that just want to celebrate a type of whiskey that, someone made the joke once at an event, but they said, had this country been settled west to east and not east to west, bourbon wouldn't exist. And they're right, absolutely right about it. I know it's a hard thing to assume, but it's hard not to see how that's potential. I mean, people came to this country having a tradition of distilling, barley, and then finding that there wasn't the opportunity to grow it in the Northeast. So as you get out to the west side, it's this huge opportunity, or you get out to the West Coast, there's barley everywhere. You can make this stuff. So I think inherently it's kind of built into it. But yeah, we're in a real renaissance period right now. There's a lot of cool, interesting stuff going on.
Yeah,
that's true. And John was wondering, he's saying, Chris, I believe the currently American single malt must use new oak. Would you prefer it stay that way or switch to used oak, or an option of the distiller to use either?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I wonder if, John, what you're trying to say here is that malt whiskey, the definition of malt whiskey technically requires new American oak. That is not the case in the American single malt definition that we sent to the TTB. So the standard of identity, and again, I'd encourage people go to AmericanSingleMaltWhiskeyCommission.org. Get over there, sign up as an individual. You can get updates from us. It's a good place for you to be seeing what we're doing as an industry right now and leading sort of charge on. But we very specifically set it up to say that it didn't require new oak. It has to be matured in oak barrels, but it doesn't need to be new or used. And it didn't even specify whether it needs to be American oak. It's just oak casks.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah. And that was back to this idea of the consumer is going to tell you whether or not this is something they're interested in. Listen, if you go down to Balcones and they've got these great post oak, kind of things that they want to do, or they've got live oak and you want to do that, well, then let them do it. It shouldn't be our position to kind of go to them and say, oh, we're not going to allow that, or that's not what we want to do. It might not be what we want to do at Westland, but it doesn't mean that for another producer, it's not a really interesting thing that's worth doing.
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, there's a load of interesting whiskey coming out right now, and whiskey that has a real sense of place. That is something, if anyone were to say what Westland is, Westland has a sense of place. We recognize the Pacific Northwest. We think it reflects very clearly in our whiskey, but there are other distilleries that are doing this as well, and that's a great thing to see right now.
Yeah.
Oscar's agreeing. He said there's a ton of good stuff being produced, but he still has his money on the West Coast.
Well, that's good, Oscar. It's always strong to bet on Washington.
All right.
So if you had to pick one thing to change about about the industry, what would you change?
Oh man, there's quite a few things actually.
Or two or three. I mean, what would be the biggest one that's like, man, if I could change this?
Yeah, I would remove a lot of the barriers to entry for producers. It is, you know, if you've never been involved in distribution and things like that, it is enormously challenging for upstart distilleries to get involved. And obviously, we don't have that issue at Westland. We're really fortunate in that regard. But you know, I'm a firm believer that cream rises to the top. You know, we need to become more competitive. A lot of times, really good stuff just doesn't ever get visibility because you sign a bad distribution agreement or you don't have the means to support the action on the ground. But the whiskey's good and it needs to get out there. So that would be one thing I would change. And then I'd argue that the sort of the other thing that I would really want to look at is a lot of and it's more of a consumer thing, a lot of the dogma that exists in whiskey that's just frankly incorrect. It is, you know, we fashion the American consumer to be pretty mindful about whiskey. But I will tell you, as much as I love traveling this country and I love selling whiskey here, we are not the most educated whiskey consumers in the world. There are other countries that put us to shame when it comes to that. And it means that, you know, being educated about whiskey doesn't mean you taste a lot of things. It means you really learn it. You treat it like a skill, something that you want to hone and get better at. And it's things like this, and it's doing educational stuff, really learning about your trade. That's super important. It's, you know, we should be expecting that. And it's funny because, not to pull it back to a Westland thing, but that's where something like that book comes into place. It's like we put that out because we know that whether or not you want it or you know enough to even ask about those things now, if we start telling you those things, maybe you'll start asking other producers, and that'll force them to up their game. I went back to school a couple of years ago to get my master's in brewing and distilling sciences from Harriet Watt because I thought that it was dishonest for a salesperson to not actually really understand the science of what they do and what they sell. And I think that's something that we can ask of our consumers as well. It's like, if you love something, that's fine, love it, but understand what you love about it and be very clear in that, because it's only going to benefit our industry long term. It's don't just latch onto something for the sake of it. Understand what you like about it, and then, you know, get behind that idea.
It's kind of like with cars. Like, I like the '68 Chevelle because the paint is nice on it. You know, like for going everything under the hood, it's like I just like the color of blue it is. You know?
Yeah, but I mean that's.
I was just gonna get to, and in the book as well too. You guys give a tasting wheel. I mean, just to help put people down more of the path you want them to go down, to start thinking about that stuff. Where a lot of people, like my friend Sean was on the show the other night, and he's always concerned that he doesn't smell or taste as much because he doesn't have as much experience. I'm like, well, that's the way it is. But half of it is reading something like that's helping connect the flavor profile to what you have had experience with. You know, like you might not have come up with it, and usually a lot of times someone else says it, and you're like, oh yeah, I'm getting that. Where if you kind of see it, that will help kind of narrow in. And with the flavors, the amount of flavors that you guys have, I think that's actually extremely useful for your whiskey.
And we've actually just built Steve and I, our director of marketing, been building this new tasting wheel idea right now, where it's a tasting wheel that's built around the idea of where do these flavors come from a raw material perspective. So it's like, okay, you tasted coffee and chocolate. Well, that flavor doesn't exist in yeast, and it doesn't exist in oak, and it doesn't exist in maturation. It's a very specific barley-driven flavor, and that's one of the things that we're trying to do is, listen, that tasting wheel that's in there, that thing is amazing, right? In that it's not ours. That is just an open source tasting wheel. The idea is that there are these sort of primary categories of aroma or flavor, and then it allows you to get quite specific the further out you go. It's you do yourself a disservice when you go into something and you go, oh, this smells like red fruit. It's like, well, there's four of us here. So, okay, a red fruit for me is a cherry. For one of you, it's a strawberry. For one of you, it's a raspberry. And one of you, it's an apple. They're all red fruit, but they don't taste or smell anything alike. So it's getting specificity is a good thing. It's a good thing in whiskey. It's a good thing for transparency, and it's a good thing for understanding what your palate likes, because the more you understand the flavors of what exists in whiskey, and then you understand, okay, well, I like this American single malt that had this flavor very specifically, and this other American single malt had it. Now you start looking for where there's process-driven consistencies or raw material consistencies, because you can go, okay, well, that flavor must originate from this because that's where I'm getting it.
Mm-hmm. And then being able to figure out what that is with all the information you guys hand out is what I like. Where it's like I can do the nerding myself and start crossing off stuff when you're doing a taste test with other whiskeys. Like, it's not from this malt, that's gone. Just start narrowing it down.
I think you're going to see more and more of this. I think this is the tip of the iceberg. I think this is the new normal in COVID is now accessibility of information is critical. And if you're not going to be able to go out and do whiskey dinners and do bar events and things like that, you need to be able to provide people with that at-home information. We're updating the website to have all of this stuff on a regular basis. It is the producers that don't do this are going to be left behind. It's as plain as that. And the best way that you can ensure that other producers do this as well is to stop buying their product until they do.
Yeah. See, and that's what I really appreciated and enjoyed, especially for the people watching what you did early on. And when we were talking about the American oak, you broke down, okay, the yeast is providing these notes, these specific flavors, these aromatics that you're getting. The barley is providing this. The oak is providing this. What you generally see from most distillers and from most whiskey producers is, well, here's our nosing, here's the nose, here's the tasting notes, here's the finish. But you don't have an understanding of what exactly in the whiskey is producing those specific notes. Yeah. And so to help people to be able to discern that, and then you can carry that experience and that knowledge to tasting other whiskeys and helping pick other things out. That to me is what's absolutely beautiful about, all this and what you guys are doing. And I'll just say this, for those watching that haven't tried Westland yet, I'm struck by the aromatics. I'm struck by the flavors. It's great whiskey. I mean, it's just absolutely fantastic. But the balance of everything,
yes,
and how well integrated all the notes are. I mean, I'd just say kudos to your blender because it's doing an absolutely incredible job with the way this is all structured and put together. That's what's. I mean, we taste a lot of whiskeys. We sample a lot of things. We went through a tasting, just the night before where we tasted a whiskey that was very out of balance with things. And everything is just an incredible balance. And it's striking compared to all the other whiskeys that we taste. I mean, we've had some good stuff, but this one, the way it's all integrated in and how balanced all the notes are, I'm deeply, deeply impressed.
That's cool. I appreciate you saying so. And it is, again, I mean it. That's the kind of praise we're looking for. We're looking for people to taste these whiskeys and say, a lot of great whiskey out in the marketplace is like reading a sensational quote, right? It catches your attention, but then like you're looking for the substance around it and you go, oh, there's really not much there. When you pick up Westland, we might not have the high or the low, but there's a consistency in it that what you get out of the whiskey is a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a story being told here, and it's the story of raw materials and a story about a sense of place. And that you're able to perceive that from the things that we're doing, it's hard not to sort of overstate it, but it's like, that's what real care in production and being thoughtful in your process is. It's if your thought process when you're making whiskey is, okay, well, we want to make the best whiskey of the year by X magazine. I guess that's a good goal to have for some people. But if you try to connect what you're doing as a distillery to your central philosophy, who you are and what you believe in as a distillery, I am convinced you will forever make much more compelling whiskey.
Well, I think what Ben was talking about was, I kind of viewed it as the way you were describing what was creating what in the flavor profile and kind of the nose was, you guys were doing a very good job of creating the whiskey creation story. Like, this is our whiskey and this is how we got to, this is how we got to it, where not everyone is they're kind of telling you this is what's in it, but not this is how it created. This is the smells. These are how you're getting from A to B. And I love it quite a bit. And Spencer was just saying that the sherry blew his mind, and I can totally see that.
I'm glad people are enjoying them, and hopefully, I see in the comments people are asking, where can we get them? If you get onto the website www.westlanddistillery.com, we've got a where to buy or how to find kind of thing, and you spend some time there, and you should be able to find a relatively local retailer for you. And then we're obviously available on things like Caskers and Reserve Bar as well. So there's accessibility via the online side.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question. Go back something you said earlier when you told the story about being an inspiration. Who's your inspiration?
Wait, as an individual or as Westland?
As a distiller or industry person.
There's a couple of people that when I think about sort of the path they've laid, there's something really endearing to the way they do it. So, it's hard not to look at someone like Springbank and go, oh man, they've kind of stuck to the way that they want to do things. They're a very traditional place. Certainly, I mean, you look at the way Bruichladdich has a reverence for raw materials, and there's a lot of shared cultural and philosophical things going on there. I mean, they're our sister distillery, but they mean the world to us. And when I talk to my counterpart over there, Lynn, and I talk to Murray and Douglas and their team, it's like to see and hear the way they think about whiskey philosophically, and how, admittedly, as someone that's been on that side of the fence before and said, man, it is really challenging to do these deep philosophical exercises with the way that the SWA regulates whiskey in Scotland. It's pretty incredible to see how much they're willing to poke the bear on that side of things. And it's a scary, dangerous game to play, but they do it because they really do want to make an environment much more consistent with what we're doing here in the States with the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission.
I like when they poke the bear. Yes. I find it hysterical when they poke the bear.
They enjoy doing it too, I think. But they're doing it the right way, right? They're not going around. They're not doing it just for the sake of saying like, well, we can, so we will. They're doing it because they say like, well, it's ridiculous that we can't tell a customer the age of all the whiskeys in this. It's like, well, of course we want to be able to do those things. It's, there are things that we just take for granted, the type of things that we can be on this and you can ask me these questions and I'll answer them for you, that are no big deal. But when you can't actually do that, that is a really weird way of rewarding people that want to buy your product.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Excuse me while I be shady for a second. It's required by law.
I mean, admittedly, that's kind of true, and I guess that's something that's very frustrating. It's industry should do everything they can to make people feel like they're a part of the process, and if you continually kind of keep people at arm's length, then you're relying on the magic. Which, oh God, you want to. Like you were asking about things that I hate in the industry. People that talk about magic when it comes to whiskey is probably chief number one, because there's no magic. It's good science. Yes, there's magic to like an aspect of what happens when it's laying in a barrel, because obviously that's not 100% fully sort of understood in a perfect way. That's why a tree can produce 2 or 3 barrels and they can all taste slightly different with the same distillate and the same maturation. But I don't know. The reliance. The lazy brand ambassador says it's magic instead of actually knowing why. And more often than not, there's a scientific explanation for a majority of these things.
Mm. Sorry, I was just finishing the
yeah.
Sorry, the peated. All right, there's a whole other show we're doing where it's blind tasting, and these ones are sliding into it because. The peated one.
That's a fun thing to put into a blind tasting for American Oak because it's so obvious. You look like a genius. You're like, oh yeah, that's Westland American Oak. It's like, oh, right there.
Even with the peated one, to slide this into some other peated stuff, I think a lot of people would be confused by where they would place it or what they actually thought the home of it is. But once again, this one's extremely nice. Now, privately in the chat, because we are running over, Mike and Ben made a trilogy of these, so I'm going to pour them together as well too.
Oh man, just getting wild here, guys.
Yeah, it's spoiler alert. It's a great blend.
Yes,
you take three very well balanced whiskeys with the same DNA in them, and you put them together, and man, it's.
So I will tell you, we've actually done that at the distillery. It's not a precise 1-to-1-to-1, obviously, but Westland Winter was a special release we did a little while ago that was peated spirit. Oh God, I want to say it was in an Pedro Jimenez Hoghead, but now I'm thinking it might be Oloroso. Forgive me. And then we've done a bunch of sort of. I will tell you, if you've had a bottle of Coldfoot, which is a release we've just recently done, and we've got another allotment of it coming out in a couple of weeks. I guess a couple of months, excuse me. That's built around peated in sherry, which obviously still has some five malt in there as well. And it's hard not to really enjoy that. That flavor, peated and sherry, play really well off each other.
Yes, they do.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm a big Ardbeg fan. Ugadal's one of my favorites.
Yep.
Dark Cove. So that whole sherry peat combination is just absolutely magic in just about any kind of whiskey you can get. So, striking the balance here with these, I mean, just in blending all three of them, but a little bit of peat with a little bit more sherry and then the American oak in there. And this is amazing. And I'll throw out, I see locally here, you guys have a pack, like a sample pack of 375s of all three of these core whiskeys that are available. And, anybody wanting to get these and just to be able to try all three of them, that's a great way to go.
Yeah.
And we don't see a lot of distilleries doing that. And kudos to you guys.
We're not making them anymore. I just
No.
want to
Well,
yeah, they're the end of it. They're two, and for what it's worth, just so people get their expectations set up, they're 200 mLs of all three of them.
Yeah.
okay.
They're definitely in market. There's still a bunch of states that have them. I think we've gotten to the point now where like the whiskey's out. It's available enough that we wanted to just kind of really focus on the 750s. And with how much we're bottling now for other countries, we just have to be. Those things were a nightmare to bottle because they don't actually fit the machine, the bottling line.
Yeah.
They're all hand fills. Oh God.
Yeah,
That's usually what we've heard as to why most distillers don't tackle that kind of thing.
It's just too expensive to do that one. We'd rather just sell you this one for a couple bucks less. Just call it even. I'm like, I can understand.
It's a little
that.
bit easier. Obviously pre-COVID, I just tell people, find a great local whiskey bar and badger them into finding some of it. But for the most part, I don't think any of you will have a tough time. Our distribution network now is big enough where, within striking distance, you'll be able to find someone. And obviously, anyone that's really into whiskey knows their sort of local destination store or some place that's within an hour or so's drive to really go and grab, you load up once or twice a year. But they're out there and hopefully we're well represented. But listen, I'll be the first to admit, if we're not in those places and it's the kind of store that they hand sell whiskey, tell them to give us a look. It means a lot. I've always found it interesting that people go into these things and they're like, we don't need the help. We can do it on our own. It's like, no, we definitely need the help and we'd love it if you would. It means a lot to us. Like, the day that we don't need that help, I'll be driving to work in a Ferrari, but we are a long ways away from that. Help us. Listen, if you want these things to survive, and not only to survive, but be successful, it's about helping sort of evangelize it and tell the story. And it means a lot because if you're coming in and you love whiskey and they know you buy a lot of whiskey and then you're like, oh man, I just had Westland, this stuff's amazing. Boy, that goes a million times longer than me, brand ambassador, coming in from the distillery saying like, hey, you guys should buy this. And they're like, well, of course you're going to say that.
Well, there's a lot of that I think just like when people get a comfort level with a store, some people are too afraid to talk to the store clerks and ask them questions. The worst they're going to tell you is no. That's the worst that's going to happen. And you already didn't find it on the shelf. So then, whoop-de-doo. But once you start asking for those things, you start to build a relationship. And a lot of times there will be some places that pay attention to what you're saying if you get to know the clerks well enough or people like that. And we had another person on the show, Malcolm and Phillips. What he did a couple of times is he found something from a distiller that someone brought him, and he brought it to his liquor store and was like, I want you to try this. So if I ask you, what you're getting into. If you're not just buying a bottle for me, you can buy a case and you feel comfortable with it. And that seems like a lot of an extra two steps. But a lot of whiskey is sharing it with people you enjoy it with. And why not enjoy it with the guy who owns the store?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%, absolutely.
And I'm going to jump back here. I was going to say, DJ was wondering when your distillery will be open for tours and tastings again.
So we've just had this conversation. It looks like we are going to be, if we're not as of today, we will be reopened for tastings within the week. We're probably still going to be a little ways off before we do tours, and obviously you'll have to follow all the guidelines. But I would encourage people to, check out westlanddistillery.com, and we'll have updates on the timing of that. The distillery is typically open Tuesday through Sunday, from sort of noon on. But yeah, it'll still be a little ways before we have tours back on.
Well, that's right, and it's worth going down there, DJ. I definitely would if I were you and I were much closer. It would be a place I'd go, and you're probably going to pick up a couple bottles. And knowing your flavor profile, I'm guessing you'd like the American oak and the sherry the best from your flavor profile, DJ. It's really nice.
We still have some Lucky Envelope, DJ. That's the play. Lucky Envelope cask exchange right now. If there's any left, it is spectacular.
Okay, now that's something you have to do, DJ. Is you have to.
Congratulations, DJ. You're now Sherpaing whiskey back for everyone.
That is the Sherpa or a whiskey mule that's been known to make its way across the country. This is the combo of the three is exceedingly good as well too. It's disturbing how well that went together. Just blending these three, it really is pretty sweet. Now we know we've kept you on here a while, but is there? Let's take the last couple of minutes here. What do you guys have coming out in the near future that you'd like to tell people about? Take a couple minutes or two, pimp the channel, and pimp the company.
So I mentioned earlier our Garyana release. So Garyana is classically released in the sort of the October, November, December season. The new release, the 2020 edition of Garyana, will be available early November this year. We've produced a little bit more than we have historically speaking, because honestly, we were just selling out of it pretty quick, and we wanted to give more people accessibility to it. We didn't raise the prices this year, which I'm something really, really proud of. We were able to kind of keep all that consistent, which is easier said than done, as you can imagine, as we're growing production of it. The 2020 is going to be a pretty significant deviation from the way that we've done Garyana in the past. I don't want to spoil it too much, but if you enjoyed the 2016 that had some peated distillate in it, you'll probably really like the 2020 edition that's coming out. Let's put it that way. And it's I've just tasted our lab bottles. They're absolute bangers. They're such good whiskey, and I'm really, really excited about that coming through. In the spring of next year, we're going to be releasing the very first edition of our Washington State Skagit Valley Barley Series, which is super exciting. And you'll be able to find out more information on that. We've just released some of our press information on that, but it's going to be called Calere. It's the Latin word to cultivate. It's part of a sort of a reimagining of the way that we're looking at these whiskeys, Garyana, an Outpost, and then eventually a whiskey in a few years' time called Solum. That's going to be our Washington State Peat project that we're still laying down whiskey for right now, but we're calling it the Outpost range because at its foundation, what we're doing at Westland with our house profile, we're an outpost to a certain degree at the very beginning, right? The idea of roasted malts, the idea of a non-distiller's yeast, the idea of air-dried new white American oak as being sort of central tenets to the way that we make whiskey. Those things were very sort of beyond the normal of what the whiskey industry and certainly what single malt whiskey was doing at the time. So we said to ourselves, well, what is the next sort of outpost, right? How do we push those boundaries even further and sort of shine light into those areas of whiskey where more exciting and new things are going to be able to start coming out of it? And Garyana undoubtedly has been a big part of that, right? Celebrating a native resource in Gary oak trees or Oregon oak has been really exciting, and just such wonderful whiskeys. Obviously, we've been spending, and I talked about this, we've put this money now into this PhD student with Washington State University's in the Bread Lab. We've been partnering with the Bread Lab and Dr. Steve Jones for going on almost a dozen years now, or at least 10 years, or nearly 10 years now, excuse me, working with Skagit Valley Malting and getting them to provide a localized economy for farmers there to be able to grow non-commodity varietals of barley, where we're focused on the actual flavor of the barley and not just on the flavor of the whiskey, but what flavor do these new varietals of barley potentially put through, and giving this region an opportunity to grow barley that they can actually harvest and sell in the open marketplace is really exciting. And it's hard not to look at those things and realize that Westland is, we're not even scratching the surface of our potential right now. I think what we're doing with the core range are really wonderful whiskeys, and I'll continue to be a huge consumer of American oak because I think the whiskey is wonderful. The things that we are doing with the Outpost range, with Garyana, with Calere, and eventually with Solum are going to be things that are so far beyond what the whiskey industry is doing right now that it is going to take people some time to catch up to, like, okay, these are now things that have become somewhat normalized, because in the beginning they're going to be very outspoken, very unique, And that's, to me, that's our role, you know, as a vanguard of single malt whiskey and certainly of American single malt, and being a philosophical leader in this industry, we have to do those sort of things because it's the best way to really discover a sense of place and to understand where you've come from is to embrace sort of the culture and the agricultural systems around you.
And I think it sounds like it's becoming like a hyper regional release almost, like where it's really broken down. Like you're getting the experience of almost like maybe a county or two, you know, like it's all packed in here and you're getting something kind of unique. So I really like where you guys are headed with stuff and the way you're doing it.
There's some really amazing stuff. And then we've got some really cool local releases coming up. We're going to have another cask exchange release later in the year with a very well-known Seattle-based brewery that I think people are going to be super excited about. I won't say specifically who right now, but I think people are going to be, I can't imagine that one's going to last very long at the distillery. I've already put in my own allocation for a few bottles of that to make sure I get locked out. But it's exciting. You know, we're 10 years in now. Westland's been around for 10 years now. We've been commercial for 7. But we've been a functional distillery for 10 years, and to see how far we've come in just 10 short years and how much change we've been able to really force into the industry makes me very hopeful for what the next 10 years potentially have for us.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about getting to that 20-year mark where we're just getting to the 10 for a lot of craft distillers, I think you're going to be getting more of that stuff where people are going to be coming to you and saying, you guys are an inspiration to what we're doing with other smaller distilleries. Just, I feel like you are a leader at the beginning and now, and are going to continue to be so by the way you've set up the terms that you do business.
Now, it's certainly the hope, and you know,
I cherish the way you guys are doing it.
It's awesome to know that people are taking note of what we're doing, and honestly, I don't even mind if they emulate it as long as they're pushing things forward. That's really what we should all be trying to do right now. So that's the hope, is that it's having this lasting, real impact on our industry.
All right, we've kept you on here for an hour and a half, and that's long enough. We know
I was happy to be on. I appreciate you guys letting me be a moment in this and have a moment to chat a little bit about Westland. So thanks for giving me a platform to do it.
We'd always love to do it. And as you guys have anything new or interesting coming out in the future, if you want to talk about it, let us know. We'd be more than happy to have you guys back on and get, you know, behind the curtain a little bit further again at some point. Our fans typically will bleed you for the knowledge that you have.
Well, listen, I'll make the open offer. If people really want to know stuff, I'm not a hard person to get a hold of. I'm Chris at westlanddistillery.com. You know, hit us up at info@westlanddistillery. Follow us on Twitter. Follow us on Instagram at Westland Whiskey. You know, follow us on Facebook. Join up with that. Be a part of this conversation. You know, sign up at AmericanSingleMaltWhiskey.org. That's a great way to keep abreast of what we're doing with the commission. Things are going to happen at light speed over the next couple of years, and things are going to come and go very, very quickly as these new things come to the marketplace. And the best way to keep abreast of it is just by, you know, making accessible to it. Exactly.
Well, we appreciate you coming on. Before we go, Mike or Ben, do you have any other questions? I don't want to cut you off, so
I don't. My questions would all be personal in nature and selfish.
Mike, you can send me an email as well. It's okay.
Well, that's fair. Well, everyone in the chat, thank you for stopping in. We appreciate you stopping in and joining us to chat and a couple good questions. Chris, like we said, we can't thank you enough for coming on. We're so happy to have you here and proud of what you guys are making. And it's something that if you haven't had, saying it's worth a bottle is an understatement. Definitely grab one. You are not going to be disappointed with what you pick up.
Not at all.
But for everyone out there, remember, it's not the size of the den that matters. It's the love of whiskey. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.
Let's get into it. 1, 2, 3. Let's get some more. Have it in. Some more.